Hello, welcome to the meeting. We will be beginning momentarily.
Hi, everybody who's joining from home and virtually. I'm Emily Stock with the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. I'm here in Bedford for our public information meeting on the Bedford rail stop. And we've still got a minute or two, so we'll get started as soon as everybody is sitting down here. So just give us a minute or two and I will start back up again. Thank you. Yeah, we've got 40 people signed up to do it. 40 people signed up to do it virtually. So in addition to everybody who's here. Okay, folks are still filtering in. I'll get started in just a minute. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Bruce. Sure. And we'll be posting it on our website also.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Whenever you all are ready, we can get started. Are there some folks filtering in still? Okay. 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 And these are all, it's all town of Bedford. Well, it looks like we're at about, let's see, 5:33. If everyone's okay, I can go ahead and get things started. And I'm going to be sitting down so that the camera captures me. Hopefully you all can hear me okay online. We're doing this informational meeting for the Bedford rail stop study, virtually and live. So we've got over 40 people who are joining us this evening via web, and I've got my phone here with texts from my team in case anything goes wrong, if there are any technical issues on the other side. My name is Emily Stock. I'm with the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, and I appreciate you all having me here tonight. I have a few housekeeping notes that I can go over, but first I want to thank the Mayor of Bedford. Mayor Black is here, and some of the council people from the town of Bedford also. We have Councilman Bruce Johansson, hopefully I said that right, and Bruce Hartwick, and also Stacy Haley, who is a member of the BFRRI. Thank you very much for coming. So welcome to the Bedford Franklin Passenger Rail Stop Study Informational Open House. We're excited to offer this meeting both in person and virtually to reach a wider audience. And we ask for patience and understanding if we experience any issues or delays this evening. So far, so good. And hopefully I'll get a text if anything goes wrong. So before we get started, I'll go over a few items. We ask that those attending in person wear a face covering when not addressing the group and practice social distancing. Fortunately, we have a nice setup here, so everyone's socially distanced. Tonight's meeting is open for public viewing and is being recorded. So the recording will be available on the DRPT YouTube channel tomorrow, and a link will be posted to the DRPT website as soon as possible. Should you have any technical difficulties, this is for those of you all who are attending virtually, if you have any technical difficulties during the meeting, please log off and try logging back into the meeting. If you still experience issues, please contact our tech support for assistance. And the email address for the tech support is on the screen, drptpr@drpt.virginia.gov. And there will be a designated public question and comment period following the presentation. And if the virtual audience has questions throughout the presentation, you can use the question feature in the attendee control panel on the right. We'll address your questions during the designated comment period. And I am going to minimize my window here because it's on top of my screen. Whoops. Maybe I can't minimize it. Oh, hide control panel right there. Very good. And we asked that all the in-person folks save your questions and comments until the end. If you wish to provide feedback after the meeting, comments and questions can be sent post-event to the email address that's up here, and I'm happy to give it to you if you want me to write it down for you later, because we don't have handouts for the meeting. And subject line would be Bedford Rail Stop Study, or you can mail it to our office in Richmond, 600 East Main Street, Suite 2102, Richmond, Virginia, 23129. Attention, Emily Stock. So with all that, we can begin. Again, I'm Emily Stock with the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, and I'm going to be asking my team to advance the slides as we move ahead. So next slide, please. So we talked about questions and comments. I just went over that. Next slide. So the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. Some of you all may be familiar with our agency. Some folks may not be. We're a sister agency to VDOT. We're separate from VDOT, but we are part of the Transportation Secretariat at the Commonwealth of Virginia. Our focus is the movement of people and goods throughout the Commonwealth. And our primary areas of activity are rail, public transportation, and commuter services. DRPT works with local, regional, state, and federal governments, as well as private entities to provide support for projects and programs like this one. So really happy to have you here to talk a little bit more about potential future Bedford station. Next slide, please. So the study scope. The DRPT has been working on this study with BFRRI for the last couple of, actually for about a year and a half now, and we took a little hiatus during COVID. But these are some of the steps that we went through as part of the study. We developed a planning level conceptual design for a potential station. We looked at station layouts and locations around the area, consistent with Amtrak, Norfolk Southern, and DRPT and Town of Bedford standards. We also looked at probable construction costs. So we developed those as part of the study for different station alternatives. We did a traveler survey that was conducted, and we reported the results to inform a ridership forecast. We also did a ridership analysis that showed us the potential ridership, and also developed a specific methodology for this area for station concepts. And then in addition to that, most recently, we've been working on a General Assembly study that that looks at rail operations modeling. So we worked closely with Norfolk Southern, the host railroad, to conduct an operations modeling analysis to assess any infrastructure or network costs that would be necessary to service a rail station in Bedford. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. We've been busy over the years. Back in 2014, we signed an agreement to extend passenger rail service from Lynchburg down to Roanoke, and that was an agreement between the Commonwealth of Virginia, Amtrak, Norfolk Southern Railway, and the city of Roanoke. And around that time, the Bedford-Franklin Regional Rail Initiative, which I'll be referring to as BFRRI, was also formed in 2014. And the town of Bedford and DRPT and the Commonwealth both did passenger rail station feasibility studies in 2016, and one for the town of Bedford, one was done by DRPT. We looked at costs in those studies, and also looked at ridership. Of course, fast forward to now, we've had a few years now under our belt of Roanoke service, which has been very helpful to us in projecting potential ridership for Bedford also. So we have some more data to lean on, and that's helped inform our study. And we also, though some of you all may be familiar, we did hold a kickoff meeting for this study, for this rail stop study back in September of 2019. So we had that over in Manita, and we had some folks come in and take a look at the study scope and some of the methodology. And we've been meeting with the BFRRI since then to talk about our results, some of the preliminary results, some of the feedback that we got from Norfolk Southern, and you'll hear a lot about that tonight. Next slide, please. So site location analysis. As I mentioned, there were some previous studies done. We looked at a number of folks looked at a number of sites in the area, and we kept coming back to these considerations that are up on the screen right now. Obviously, there are a lot of entities that control railroad traffic. The host railroad, Norfolk Southern, obviously the Federal Railroad Administration and Amtrak, they all have guidelines for how passenger rail should work, and all have guidelines that would apply to a station here. The Federal Railroad Administration has guidelines for high-level platforms, and that's something that if you've been to the station at Roanoke, you're familiar with. It allows you to walk straight from the train without having to go down quite a few steps to get to the platform. And Norfolk Southern, the host freight railroad, does not allow adjacent high-level platforms to their mainline tracks. So we had to figure that out, and those are things we had to consider. And of course, Amtrak also prefers high-level platforms, and it also requires that platforms be placed next to tangent tracks so that they have a straightaway, so that trains can stop and unload and reload along the platform outside of a curve. So as we were looking for station sites, these were items that we needed to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So site programming, DRPT looked at the studies that were done previously to determine what potential ridership could be, and also consulted with Amtrak and Amtrak guidance to figure out what size station we need. Amtrak has lots of information out there, and they have different categories of stations that they recommend based on different ridership levels, and each one of those station categories has a prototype, and the guidance shows us what amenities are required depending on the ridership level, depending on the category of station. And so as we did our research early on, we determined that a caretaker station category was the right one for Bedford, and so we based our space planning, based our location planning on that size of station. Next slide, please. And so this map shows where we considered station locations, and this is generally downtown Bedford along the Norfolk Southern tracks. And you'll see that the green areas are straight track, so that's our tangent track. We have curved track in red. There is some slightly curved track in yellow. So we were really limited in where we could site a station. It needed to be obviously adjacent to the tracks and also along one of those green sections so that we'd have enough space. And you'll see we had a number of station locations that were considered, and we took all of these station locations through a screening process. One of the sites that was that we really focused on from the very beginning was the Courthouse Site. That might be one that you're familiar with. It's right downtown, and there would be advantages for sharing parking there. It's where a depot was located many years ago. It's right in the central business district. So we did take all of these sites through our screening process, but that was definitely one that we focused on as we went along. Next slide, please. And so we looked at a number of different criteria to do our analysis. There are some that are brought up by by Amtrak in their guidance. They look for available multimodal services. They look for safety and security and visibility of the station site. They look at sustainable design and adequate length for side platforms. They look at adequate parking, whether a site is ADA accessible, and also to have enough space for functional requirements. And so those functional requirements are the functional requirements of a caretaker station. And that I described before. So a platform with a canopy, a station building, we even need enough room for that. Also room for parking, for rental cars, for auto and taxi pickup and drop off, and also the signage and lighting, trash pickup, those types of things. So those are the functional requirements that are necessary. And other criteria that we looked at, we wanted to make sure that any site that we were considering would have adequate zoning for this type of use, that there would be compatible neighboring land uses, that it'd be close enough to US 460 for a comfortable drive, making sure that topography is as level as possible, because we know we'd have to deal with that eventually. Construction costs obviously are a criteria, real estate costs, access to central business district, and proper utilities. And for those of you all who are joining us virtually, it is raining pretty hard here. We've got a storm coming through, so hopefully the lights won't flicker. Next slide, please. It'll just blow over while we're here, and it'll be dry when it's time to go. That's what we'll hope for. So as I mentioned, Courthouse is one of the shortlisted alternatives. I'm showing you this to give you an idea of what the functional elements are, how they would lay out on paper. But obviously this is a prototype. It's not what we ended up with. But I wanted to show you some of those elements. So we would be building an intertrack fence to discourage trespassing between station and freight tracks, because we would, in order to have a high level platform that's this close to the railroad tracks, as I mentioned before, Norfolk Southern won't let us have a high level platform adjacent to their tracks because it's there are safety issues with mainline freight use. So we wanted to make sure that we're designing for a high level platform by having a rail siding, a passenger rail dedicated siding for any site that we looked at. That way we could have level boarding and still allow for the freight to keep on moving. So having that intertrack fence is important. We also wanted to, I mentioned before, the station track to clear freight traffic and allow for a high level platform. We designed a 15-foot wide platform with, it's 1,000 feet long, to provide for level boarding all the way, for every car that ends up stopping there. It really helps with loading and unloading when you can open every door and there's a platform to step out onto and have a long platform. We looked at a minimum of 170 parking spaces at this site, and also designed for a car drop-off lane with a bypass. We designed for bike and pedestrian access, a bus drop-off, and then for this particular site, we would be looking at potentially 7 affected parcels. So, not every site has the property completely assembled, and so we wanted to make sure that we documented that as we were going through our site selection process. So this is the kind of information, this is the kind of the level of design that we had for the sites that we were considering. Next slide, please. So this is another map of downtown. It shows the courthouse site, and then one of the sites that we looked at early on in the screening process, known as the Macon Street East site. So there were a couple of sites that were in this area. So the Macon Street East site is one of those. And originally the courthouse site was preferred by the BFRRI, and we got some really good feedback from Norfolk Southern on our study. They looked at all of our criteria, that had their engineers look at the designs that we've done. And what they found was that at the courthouse site, if we were to use that site, we would have to have a closure of an at-grade street. So there's an at-grade crossing with Grove Street right there, just east of the courthouse site. And so in order to make that work operationally for the railroad, that street would have to be closed. So we looked at options for the potential for closing that, adding an overpass of some kind, adding a pedestrian overpass. What would the cost be to the surrounding area if that crossing was closed, that at-grade crossing was closed? And what we found was that this site farther west, the Macon Street site, was preferred over a courthouse site with a closed crossing. So we really focused our energy on the Macon Street East site after that, after getting that feedback from Norfolk Southern. And we did look at cost estimates, both just for the courthouse site, building the courthouse site as a rail stop with and without the road closures. And this Macon Street East site ended up having a lower cost, even without the Grove Street closure. Next slide, please. So this is a closer look at the Macon Street East site. It's also known as the Merchant site, and that's how Norfolk Southern refers to it. So it's an alternate site. It's a combination of two sites that were considered early in screening. It's located south of the tracks on Macon Street. It's less than a 1-mile trip from the Central Business District. Our cost to construct here would be almost $11 million in 2025 construction dollars, and that includes a 40% contingency, which is standard for this level of design. It's considered conceptual design, and it includes the cost of signals and communications also. And this does also have that station track, so it has its own siding so that we aren't interfering with freight rail here when we have a high level platform, just like the other one. And but the cost estimate does not include property acquisition. The property is owned by Norfolk Southern, and we do have a dialogue with Norfolk Southern, and if this were to come to fruition, we could talk with them about acquiring the property. But it is nice that it's already assembled. So you'll see here the surface parking in gray. There is an Amtrak fence that you see in black that's on the other side of the red high-level platforms. An auto drop-off in the circular driveway here, and the caretaker station is in red. And there's also a transit drop-off. So it's a long, narrow site, but everything, all of those functional requirements are there. Next slide, please. So again, a little bit more about the cost estimates. So construction cost in 2025 dollars would be close to $8 million. That 40% contingency would be added to that, so around $11 million. And that includes track turnouts, fencing, platform, signals, building, parking, paving, and walls. Okay, next slide, please. So ridership forecasting methodology, that was another big part of our study to determine what kind of ridership we may expect if the Amtrak train were to stop in Bedford. So we looked at a number of different factors. We looked at demographics, population, employment, income in the area. We looked at the service characteristics of different modes. So the travel time by car, travel time by train, possibly if that Roanoke train were to stop here. And what the costs of driving, what the costs of taking a train would be. We also looked at air travel, compared it to air travel, and we looked at existing trip tables for those different modes to see where people were traveling to and from the most. And we also had a traveler survey that helped us calibrate trip flows and define station catchment areas to show where those riders might be coming from. And we put all of that information into an intercity passenger rail forecasting model. We had the help of a consultant team. Moffitt and Nickel was our prime consultant, and AECOM was a sub-consultant who focused on the forecasting model. And they used a proprietary model that they've also used with Amtrak. And they've helped with previous studies in this area as well. They also did and used the same methodology for a second Roanoke train, figuring out what the ridership forecast would be for that, and also a potential for a New River Valley train, an extension to New River Valley. So as we, I'll show you a little bit of information about the traveler survey. Next slide. And also about the study area that we looked at. So the study area wasn't just this area. We looked all the way up to Massachusetts, because Route 46, which serves Roanoke now and Lynchburg now, goes up north to the Northeast Corridor, past and stops in Washington, D.C., where you can connect to trains, Northeast Corridor trains that extend up to Boston. So we understand that there are travelers who are, there are seats up in the front if you're looking for one. There are a few seats over here to the side. So we wanted to make sure that we threw a wide net around those potential destinations and where people might be getting on the train. Next slide, please. So traveler surveys, we had an online survey that was open from October of 2019 to February of 2020, and we had over 1,000 respondents and an 82% completion rate, which is huge. That was a great completion rate. And we had residents, we targeted residents, visitors, and rail riders as kind of three separate categories of types of travelers. The rail riders were a sample of folks who were getting on the train at Lynchburg or Roanoke. And we asked them questions like, where's their home location, what's their trip purpose, their typical mode, how often they travel, who they travel with, what size of group, and what the makeup of their group typically is. If they travel on Amtrak, what are the boarding and alighting stations, and how do they get to the stations, the access and egress modes that they use most often. We asked them how likely they'd be to use a New Bedford passenger rail stop, and we also asked them for their top 3 factors influencing why they would decide to take the train. Next slide, please. And so these are this shows the responses by zip code for this area. Obviously, in the red, where we have the most respondents in Bedford and surrounding areas. But we also had respondents from really all over the state and up into Northern Virginia and Maryland. But most of the overwhelming number of people, 94% of the zip codes, were Virginia or Maryland. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the traveler survey results. We had a lot of results in a lot of different categories because we asked so many questions. So I'll just touch on a few of them that went into the model. But obviously, if you have questions, if you really want to dig into this, we do have a larger study. You're welcome to contact our office. And Wayne's here too. He might be able to answer some questions. But overwhelmingly, for residents and visitors alike, we saw that social, recreation, or leisure traveling, visiting family were the reasons that people were traveling in this area for the most part. So commuting to work was only about 4% of the trip purpose for the people that we interviewed or that we surveyed. Next slide, please. And looking at the frequent destinations for residents, most people were actually traveling shorter distances. As you got out of state, it was New York City was a big spot, and farther north. But there were quite a few visitors to Washington D.C. area, Northern Virginia, and just within this local area in Charlottesville. Next slide, please. And some of I thought this was interesting, the top factors influencing people to take the train. So most people talked about the ease of accessing the station as the number one, which is huge. And I think that speaks to those criteria that we looked at, how close the train is to 460 interchange, whether or not you could pick up transit, have a good drop-off facility, is very important to people as they access the train. Parking availability did factor in there too. Oh, and of course, ability to work and relax, being able to use the internet, not having to watch the road while you're traveling is huge. And convenience of schedule is important to people, and of course, novelty of taking the train. It's was still up there. Next slide, please. So along with the demographic information and that traveler survey data, we made use of a rail forecasting model to get to our forecast numbers. We looked at Virginia station boardings and alightings, and we compared a baseline to a build scenario. I'll go into that in a little more detail. Next slide, please. So these are some of the results. As I mentioned, we really looked at not just a potential Bedford station, but we looked at ridership from Roanoke and Lynchburg as well, because we know that those stations are so close that that we wanted to make sure we weren't capturing folks who were already taking the train and just counting them in a different way. So we didn't want to be double counting. And just so that you all are aware, annual ons and offs. So ons and offs, boardings and alightings, that is known as station activity. Ridership is really, we cut that number in half to express ridership. And so that station activity is equal to double the number of annual trips, as each trip both has a boarding and alighting location. So this forecast shows that the Bedford station ons and offs are projected to be 25,400 ons and offs per year. And if you cut that in half, you're at 12,700 riders. But some of those, as I mentioned, counted the existing riders on the route to divert to a Bedford station from Lynchburg or Roanoke. So we took that number and we subtracted out the ridership that we found if a Bedford station were not in existence. So we subtracted that number, and then we were able to get the incremental ridership. So if we added up all the projected activity at the stations in the region along the route, so Bedford, Roanoke, and Lynchburg, and subtracted the base on-offs, if there were no Bedford station, we got the incremental route ons and offs, which would be a little over 20,000 ons-offs annually. And then we divided those by 2 to give you the net new riders to the system per year, and that's where you get the 10,050 number, would be the net new riders per year as a result of a Bedford station. So that'd be about 28 new riders per day. And that's using Amtrak's calculations. They go on a 350-day year instead of a 360-day year. So that's what we're looking at per day. Next slide. So here we're comparing that to some of the other stations in the state. And along this, these are all stations along this route. So ridership estimates show that a new rail stop may attract approximately, well, a little over 12,000 riders per year. But as I mentioned before, some of those riders would have taken trains out of Lynchburg or Roanoke otherwise, and that means that that we've got about 10,050 net new riders to the system. And the net new ridership that could be generated from a Bedford stop represents about 6% of what we see on the entire line on Route 46 within the state of Virginia. And then if you're looking at the overall new riders or the overall riders to Bedford, the station activity, that would be about 14% of the riders that are along the line. So that gives you an idea of comparison. And this is similar, the ridership here is expected to be similar to what you might see in Ashland or Petersburg or Quantico. Those are some of the other stations in the state that are at about the same level. Next slide. So I've talked about costs, talked about ridership, and then we also, as I mentioned, worked with Norfolk Southern to get their feedback on site selection. They also helped us with some rail operations modeling. And this is the General Assembly study that I mentioned before. The General Assembly required DRPT to work with Norfolk Southern to do what's called rail operations modeling, RTC modeling, and so Norfolk Southern conducted that modeling with an over-the-shoulder review by DRPT, and this is just a little bit of information on the slide about that. Now, when we were doing our ridership analysis, we were assuming one frequency for Route 46 coming through Bedford. Now, we're now talking about the potential for having 2 trains per day stop in Roanoke. And so as we worked with Norfolk Southern, we wanted to make sure that they included those 2 trains, that they weren't just doing this rail modeling for one train, because in the future it would be nice to have 2 trains stop instead of just one. So so they did that, and they based it on the schedules that are being proposed for Roanoke. Next slide. And so this is the big reveal. What we found from Norfolk Southern was that they didn't see any material new delay for Norfolk Southern operations as a result of a stop in Bedford, which is very good news. We weren't sure what to expect, but it was nice to have that feedback from Norfolk Southern and to understand that that they didn't see any material delays. So, and our study is going to the General Assembly any day now. It's due on November 15th, but we've got the information, and you all are the first to hear the results of that. Next slide, please. And I can talk a little bit about next steps. Before I do, though, I do want to introduce Delegate Terry Austin. I see you came in as I was presenting. Thank you very much for being here tonight, and I really appreciate your support through the study too.
Thank you.
And as I mentioned, the General Assembly study is due in November, and we're working with, DRPT is working with the Federal Railroad Administration to understand what the next step should be for a potential Bedford station, and what we did through this process, what I described today, would be considered a feasibility study. And so now that we have that feasibility study under our belts, we have a conceptual design, we have some cost information, and we've done this site selection process. We could move on to a NEPA study, and if you all are familiar with that, that's the National Environmental Policy Act. There are a number of different classes of action that we could take, but it basically it's meant to determine if there would be any adverse impacts as a result of train service here, either to the natural environment or to cultural resources, and to make sure that it that adding a stop here would solve the transportation problem, that there's a purpose and need for that action. And DRPT is working with the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority also to develop a grant application for the federal CRISI grant program, and that deadline is coming up quickly. We're hoping to put in this application for planning and design, and to complete the NEPA study. So that's one of our next steps. And we, of course, want to continue coordination with the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, VPRA, with BFRRI, with Amtrak, and with Norfolk Southern. And other good news is that we do expect to start Amtrak Thruway Bus as a first step. You may recall that for Roanoke, there was a Thruway bus that was operating before any rail service went to Roanoke. Norfolk had a similar situation before rail service was extended there. And so having this Thruway bus can really help us establish some ridership interest in the area and understand what the demand may be for rail service in the future. And if you'll excuse me for 1 second, I'm getting notes from my home office who are running the slides right now. We're about to switch over to Q&A.
Thank you, Emily. We will begin with the comments collected.
So let's see here. We're going to take some questions from the online audience, and then take questions from folks who are live. And I'm just going to open up this little window here. And
hi, Emily.
I think
I
I need to turn the sound on as well. Is that right? Or is the sound on high enough so that you can give me questions?
Hi, Emily. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. We have received one question. How long does a NEPA study take?
Okay. And this is Miriam Foster, who works for DRPT. She's sitting in Richmond, and there are a few folks from DRPT who are sitting in Richmond and working behind the scenes on this presentation. So thank you very much, Miriam. And a NEPA study, the last one that I worked on took 5 years, but I don't think this one is going to take that long. That was an environmental impact statement. And those are the ones that require lots of public meetings, lots of coordination. And I've talked to FRA about the possibility of what's called a categorical exclusion or an environmental assessment, an EA. So we're not sure exactly which class of action will be determined, but I think that that's something that could be done maybe within a year.
Okay, Emily, we have another question here. How long until the Thruway bus is available? In which station would it take riders to and from?
Okay, so, and hopefully you all can hear the questions okay. All right, great. And so we're looking at having it start in the spring of 2022, so spring of next year. And I'm looking at Mary Zirkle right now because I'm not sure of the location of the stop. Are you familiar with the location of the stop, Mary? Okay. So hopefully you heard that. So the Thruway bus would go to Lynchburg, you know, up the line, upstream, and most likely the stop would be here at the visitor center. But it hasn't been determined yet.
Okay, and that is all of our questions from the virtual audience.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. I'm taking questions from the non-virtual audience now. Thank you, Miriam. And let me know. I will repeat questions if it's hard to hear for the virtual audience.
What sort of infrastructure changes are required in traffic in that area? Particularly, I'm thinking about the intersection of Lincoln and First Street, which is right now. And the way you work, a lot more traffic. Sort of changes are required in that area.
So our study really looked at the on-site improvements, and so that's something that would need to be determined. And it may be that the folks in the room have some comments about that, but it's something that a NEPA study would look at as well. We did take into account, though, the access and egress from the road. So those curb cuts that you saw and the design of the parking lot and the bus turnaround. And actually, I don't know if you saw the cul-de-sac at the end. There's a cul-de-sac that was designed. So we did quite a bit of work to make sure that there was plenty of room on site for access and egress and parking and turning around, because we knew that there was no room to turn around on that street. But as far as, I expect there could be some improvements that are needed off site as well. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's something to keep in mind as we continue. Anyone else? Yes.
Now, looking at your visual.
Okay. And I'm going to ask Randy to back up to the slide that shows the Macon Street site in relation to others. And if you'll bear with me, I can tell you which slide it is.
I'm sorry, Emily, to interrupt, but I don't believe we can hear the questions from the live
Okay,
audience.
so thank you. So the question is, where on Macon Street is this located, and what is the white building?
Yeah, right in the lower.
Right. And I'm looking at, pardon me? The shopping center? Behind Westgate, to the left of the old Coffee Saunders. Okay.
It goes until about when the asphalt runs out. You know where the road is from, it's just past that. So that's actually from the west of Walton Street, where that is 460 turning restaurants. That is where the road is from, once you get past Grace Avenue there. So that one needs to be, so that needs to assist the 4th Street side.
That may opportunity to partner with DDOT on those roads.
And then for everyone, to improve access to the site and using the road there, but actually help that area better.
So this will be a second that we got. It doesn't look like it's the north. Doesn't look like it's
And for those of you all who are virtual, if you had trouble hearing, we're talking about the road network surrounding the Macon Street site and some improvements that may be needed. And we're also having lightning and thunder here. The lights have only flickered once. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Couple things is, what would be the earliest you could possibly get current stuff? And two, last time tell us what can we do to help facilitate and move things along?
So the question is, when can we expect to have a rail stop, and how can we move things along? So with the uncertainty, so much of it really depends on funding that comes along for this NEPA study, funding that comes along for construction also. So and so it's hard to answer that question definitively right now. What I can tell you is that a few months ago, I was talking to BFRRI about next steps, and I thought that I might be applying for a planning grant for NEPA in 2022. So we've moved that up, and we're doing it this year instead. And I would expect that that just a lot of this is going to be determined by funding availability. So looking at these costs that we've talked to you about today for the station, and understanding what a potential local match might be, is something that can move things ahead. It shows commitment from the locality, from the region, and also dealing with some of those traffic issues. If there are some access issues off-site, you know, talking to VDOT and local engineers about what can be done is helpful earlier rather than later. Yes, sir. So the question was about tourism and how we handle the potential increase in tourism from Northern Virginia. Is that right? And so we did a traveler survey. There were over 1,300 respondents to a traveler survey. We had an 82% response rate, and we had some categories. We had one category of folks, visitors were one category of folks that we polled. We also polled residents and train riders, existing train riders, and so we feel like we got a good chunk of the visitor population to answer questions like, where are you coming from? Where are you going to? How would you get to a train station? How do you usually travel now? How many people do you typically travel with? So we asked those in-depth questions, not just of residents and already existing rail riders, but also visitors, to get an understanding of how they would use the train and if they would use the train. Thanks. And that, of course, went into our ridership forecast as well. Those numbers did. Yes, sir. You said for the bus service starting in the spring. I didn't hear the second part of your question. That's what we plan for, yes. Well, having high ridership would certainly demonstrate that there is a demand in Bedford for a rail stop, which would be a good thing, and it would be a good way to demonstrate that folks would take the train and that this would be a good decision to have a stop here. I think it would help with grant applications. Yes. So it's possible. I'm just going to repeat the question. So the question was about post-COVID potential ridership, because our study ended just as COVID was beginning, the survey especially. Yeah, November 5th, or let's see, February 5th. We had no idea what was coming, but I think you make a good point, and what we have seen in Virginia is that ridership is coming back. It was transit is definitely coming back, and our Amtrak ridership that we track from month to month is also rising steadily. And if you all are ever interested in ridership numbers, we report ridership numbers for Amtrak every month at the Commonwealth Transportation Board Rail and Transit Subcommittee, and so those numbers are available. I think that I think it would be interesting to look at that, but I also think that having that measure of bus ridership, if there's a Amtrak throughway bus, will be helpful to show that ridership could come back. And also looking at the Roanoke ridership over time would also be a good indicator. So I would say we don't need to redo it right now, right this minute. Yes, ma'am. To Lynchburg. So the question is, how much does that weigh in the number of people who ride that bus from throughway bus from Bedford to Lynchburg? And we don't have metrics for that. What I can tell you though is that it would demonstrate demand, and so the more people that ride it, the more it would demonstrate demand in this area, and it's something that could be mentioned on a grant application to the federal government and to the state.
If there is an inconvenience, getting onto a bus, that can be your luggage, all of that, out the station, I think that probably not to do both. So I hope that it doesn't waste so much on that. What is going to be increase in the road? Is it going to be on?
Early on, I think it was beyond what we projected, and unfortunately, I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but other folks from my office who are listening in might be able to text me so I can tell you before the end of this meeting. Yes, I was asked to repeat questions out loud, so they are listening. So the question was, how much did Roanoke ridership increase post Amtrak throughway bus? And was the ridership in Roanoke higher than was originally expected? And what I recall is that the ridership was higher than expected, but I don't have the numbers right in front of me, so I'll have to get back to you on that. And Vicki also mentioned the inconvenience of getting on a bus to then get on a train, and that's understandable. It's not a one-seat ride at that point. One-seat ride is very attractive. I will say that from my experience on Amtrak throughway buses, there are porters there to help with luggage, so they make it as smooth as possible. And I've been on trains before. Well, when you make a reservation through Amtrak's system online, the nice thing about an Amtrak throughway bus is that when you're making your reservation, it says that Bedford would be your destination. And if you're paying attention, you see it's an Amtrak throughway bus and you know what you're getting into. Some people don't necessarily notice that when they're making the reservation. I've been on the train before, someone else has made the reservation for them or something like that. I've been on the train before when people didn't realize it and they got on the bus. And this is in a military area in Hampton Roads, where I think sometimes other people buy the tickets. And folks were pleasantly surprised at how well it worked. They were expecting to have a one-seat ride on the train, and they were pleasantly surprised by how well the throughway bus worked and how comfortable it was. Just a little anecdotal information. Wow.
Obviously, this is becoming really, like you said, rather than watching road all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You're sitting there with this computer, watching a movie. It is going to continue to. And we, well, I know. But it is a 3 minutes.
That's what we're looking at. It varies, but that's what we're looking at. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, then that's referred to as dwell time. So it's a 3 to 5 minute dwell time. And it's more efficient if there are high level platforms and if their platform is long and straight. So that definitely went into our design and why we shortlisted the site that we did. And just for those of you all who are virtual, Vicki was talking about rail travel and the advantages of rail travel so that you can multitask while you're on the road. And also she said that she just traveled to New Jersey via Amtrak and that the train was very full. There were few seats left. And so we have gotten a comment that folks can't hear the discussion who are virtual. So I'm trying to repeat as much as I can what people are saying. So hopefully we're capturing that for you. Yes, sir. If you make a reservation, yes. If you make a reservation, reserve your seat, yes, you will have a seat. Anyone else?
Hi, Emily. We have another online question.
Oh, actually, Delegate Austin has a quick question. Are you okay? You're welcome. Yes, Miriam?
The question is, what do you expect the General Assembly to do with the study?
The person who might be able to answer that question is in the room, so.
Great timing.
One of the people. So the question, for those of you all who may not have heard, what is the General Assembly expected to do with the study when they get it? And this is the study that showed us what the freight rail operations would look like as a result of a Bedford stop and whether improvements would be needed for freight operations as a result. And of course, the findings are that there would not be any material delay of freight operations as a result of a Bedford stop. And of course, we would have to continue working with Norfolk Southern to make sure of that. We'd have to make sure that our schedules are still lined up for that optimal situation. But as far as what the General Assembly will say, I don't know. What I'm hoping is that they will support further study of this station and those next steps that I outlined. Delegate Austin.
So thank you for being here in this report. The town and the Tennessee County have had an interest in this for quite some time. And Dr. Mitchell, my good friend, Department of Magistrates, just paid a lot of detailed attention to our equipment, our desires here for a train stop or station in Bedford. It continues to be a tremendous interest. Obviously, the early ones reaching that first thing we had to achieve is getting that commitment has now been made. So I'm pleasantly pleased that we have two trains that we have involvement instead of just one 6:30 project. I think we'll see a decrease in our numbers later in part. Just for everyone in the room, I want everyone to understand the value and benefit that DRPT and General Commission 13 have been in the leadership of the Long Bridge, Secretary Valentine, and the governor commitment to $1 billion investment to the Long Bridge. We did a study at Interstate 95, and we had made a monetary investment in Interstate 95. By the time we completed the construction, the volume will be what it is today. So we have to find an alternative to that situation. The alternative is a train every hour on hour from Richmond to Washington. So that commitment has been made. I was pleasantly surprised to $50 million in the budget for the train to get to Christiansburg. The second train out home. the budget not for me, that's extra money. So we were able to increase that 87.5. Which I was very much surprised. I was concerned that we wouldn't have the money to make the fifty, but we increased it. We're writing more legislation that we passed a couple of years ago. That legislation appropriated $2 billion. Those $2 billion, we get $200 billion to be used for other modes of transportation. $100 billion of that used for the all day and 7 1. Through the negotiations, with some rail line acquisitions, and so on and other things. But this station is of the utmost importance. I think it will add to tourism, spring up the lake, down in Bedford. It's not going to repeat the flow in just a few minutes to stop in Bedford, but it's going to create greater advantage for the region. So Director Mitchell's done great work as to what the General Assembly will do with this study. This study is partnered with the study to get the train all the way to Act. And that's quite good. Not quite as much. I think the General Assembly will pleasantly receive this, and then we can begin to look for an appropriation to fund the stop in Bedford. Certainly we'll do that, I think, before we ever get back. Although Director Mitchell brought me a map of all the rails in Virginia from Pulaski to Acton, the rail is very straight. It's straighter than it is to Bedford. So we'll be able to move quicker, and, but it is hard. Has to be upgraded and improved. But the reason I'm telling you this is because I'm on this kind of site that we're looking at alternatives. Not just surface transportation. Highway improvement, highway transportation, that's very expensive, very difficult. It's not going to be the answer to our problems, future transportation. So, I thank you for being here. I'd like to thank Rachel for her great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Austin. I appreciate that. And I did take notes on what on what you mentioned. For those folks who may not have been able to hear, I'm not going to toot my own horn too much, but thank you for the thank you of Director Mitchell from Department of Rail and Public Transportation. And I understand from your comments that there's tremendous interest in rail stop here in Bedford, and also interest in a second frequency to Roanoke and eventually rail out to Radford, New River Valley, and hopefully you'll see higher ridership as a result of those expansions. You mentioned the leadership of Jennifer Mitchell and Secretary Valentine on the Long Bridge, which goes across the Potomac River, connecting Virginia to the Northeast Corridor in DC. The fact that there is investment going into a new Long Bridge and upgraded Long Bridge, which is a bottleneck now for rail. Also the I-95 corridor, the fact that that building another lane on I-95, by the time it's built, it would already be full. And then and the idea and the vision for having a train every hour coming from Richmond up to DC, and then the governor's investment commitment of $50 million for a train to the New River Valley, and the General Assembly's commitment to increase that to 87, and then also just that a train would add convenience for the region and options for transportation for the region. And I'm sure there's more that I didn't capture. As you mentioned, this is along with this Bedford study where the Department of Rail and Public Transportation and VPRA are looking at the costs, the feasibility of extending passenger rail to Bristol, Virginia, and so we're nearing the end of that study, and we're looking forward to getting some results and partnering with Amtrak and others, and for some future expansions. Thank you. And I'm just one apology. I'm looking at my phone to see if there are any other notes from the home office.
Hi, we
Any
have
questions?
an online question, and I
Okay.
will unmute.
Hi, this is Emily Stock with DRPT. Thanks for joining us. What's your question? You may be on mute.
Emily,
Yes, sir.
this is Ray Smoot. Good afternoon, and thank you for your work on this.
Thank you, Dr. Smoot.
Certainly a question that comes before all extensions of passenger service is who is going to pay for the station and related facilities. And we need to keep in mind that there's somewhere between 20 and 30 stations across the Commonwealth. There are also places such as Roanoke that don't have a station but would like to have a station. And I would simply say that this is a matter that I know that you and others are going to be making recommendations to the Commonwealth Transportation Board about it at some future time. And the practice in the past, I think, has generally been that the Commonwealth would pay for the track and the platforms, and the locality, whatever the locality is, was expected to pay for the station. I don't know whether that will continue to be the case in the future or not, but that's certainly a matter that is going to be before the Commonwealth Transportation Board to receive recommendations on what the policy should be going forward, and that may have implication here as well as in other places. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smoot. I appreciate that. Those are good points. So, Dr. Smoot, in addition to being a member of the Commonwealth Transportation Board, is also on the CTB Rail and Transit Subcommittee. And we talked last week at the Rail and Transit Subcommittee about the rail plan that DRPT is developing now. It's a statewide rail plan that's required by the Federal Railroad Administration. We do it every 4 years. And part of that rail plan in 2018 included a station stop policy that he referred to that showed a potential split in costs between the Commonwealth and locality. It's proposing a station. And that now that the Commonwealth owns some of, or will be owning some of the railroad along these passenger rail routes, including some of the right-of-way where the stations are located. We have an even greater responsibility to keeping those stations in a state of good repair, making sure that they're ADA accessible. So that is certainly a focus of the department. We also with this new paradigm, we're looking at stations more holistically. And so as we look at the cost of a new station, it may be a situation where there is a local percentage match rather than you know, everything on this side of the line is a local responsibility. Everything on this side of the line is a state responsibility. So we're approaching things a little bit different now that times have changed and the situation with regard to ownership has changed too. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a little confused here. We have always moved in. This has been conversation, it's like a rail station. When in actuality it was planned, and that was sort of too low. That it wasn't necessary to have full-blown stations, but to just to have a stop where you could probably purchase a ticket kiosk, but and some cover. But talking station is astronomically expensive. Stop.
So thank you for bringing up that point. So the question was about a rail stop versus a rail station, and that a rail stop has lower costs than actually building a rail station building, and that this presentation and the proposal that we have is for a caretaker station. I do, it's a good point to bring up. It's not a foregone conclusion that it would definitely have a station building, and that the caretaker station is what would be eventually built. That it was after the BFRRI looked at the potential ridership and with the help of our team doing the study, it was determined that the caretaker station would make the most sense for the amount of ridership and growth that could be expected. But that doesn't mean that that's a requirement. It's when we're doing feasibility studies like this, it's good to kind of max out the footprint to begin with, rather than aiming low. We wanted to aim high, make sure that we had a site that could accommodate all of that, all of those functional uses, and make sure we had enough room for everything. So that's the reasoning behind that. And if we look at the itemized costs of building versus platform versus parking versus site costs, we there may be some more work that could be done there as an interim step. It could start out as a platform. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
What is a caretaker station compared to, say, without a full-time employee present?
So I need to look at my notes for this, and actually Wayne right back there can help us with the answer. So Wayne Hyatt, if you have some information on this that you don't have to look up, we'll turn it over to you.
Caretaker station is an Amtrak operated station, but it only has a caretaker that employees. Caretaker would show up anywhere from an hour to a half hour before the train is scheduled to run. Spend about that long after the train has left. The station will be open during that period of the caretaker, and the station will be closed other than if the community decided they wanted to build something that also wanted to functions. Then that would be a separate occurrence. But as Emily said, the caretaker station was to size the footprint for perceived ridership for the life of the building. Not necessarily for what has to be out there. One, you don't need a caretaker station, you don't need 170 parking spaces, you don't need a lot of what you saw in that footprint. That is an incremental build that can take place with Emily's leadership and right team supporting for that station plan. Right size it for the community. Lynchburg, I believe, is a caretaker station. They only have an employee there when the station is open.
And for those of you all who are virtual, we heard the question was, what's the difference between what is a caretaker station, and is that what they have in Lynchburg? And so a caretaker station, hopefully I'm doing this right, does have an employee when the station is open and when trains are expected to come in, but it's not necessarily a full-time employee. And that is what the condition is in Lynchburg, apparently. Any other questions? I think the rain stopped. Yes, Mayor Black.
Bedford Brandon, Regional Rail Initiative, Doug Austin, your leadership. This is some exciting news today. Getting over the hurdle with Norfolk Southern and the operations and not having that be an issue. So we know there's probably many more hurdles to jump, and we understand that. But today's a good day, I think, and appreciate everybody coming out tonight and continue to show interest in the rail stop here in Bedford. And like I said, look forward to what our next steps are and how we can make this happen in the future. So thank you once again for coming.
Thank you.
I'll second that. Been aware of everything that's been going on. This has been a very long road. And Emily, you have been as with legislators, Delegate Austin being here tonight. This is, I feel like, one of the good team.
Agreed. Thank you very much, Vicki.
Actually, Delegate Austin is a appreciate the community's interest, because this is not, it's not just about that. This is improving transportation. We can't continue to fund our surface transportation. Highway improvements. That's why we have to find alternative means. I'm a firm believer in that solution, but it has to be done right. And again, regarding your caretaker station, you know, Roanoke's platform doesn't have a rush. And so that was ill planned in my. We don't want to make those mistakes here. We want to convenience. Someone comes and get out of the rough weather, goes to the restaurant, and we the train. So yeah, we may have to do it. If you know it's not a successful program, so we got to do it right. And I'm convinced that the DRPPD, Jennifer's leadership, they've done our needs throughout the Commonwealth, and we're moving that direction. We're making tremendous strides. So I look at the traffic volume on Interstate 81. It's just getting to the. We were the only interstate in Virginia that did not have a dedicated funding stream. 40% of all truck traffic on Interstate in the Commonwealth is on Interstate 81. So you know, we're committed to $2 billion. Make those improvements. That's a band-aid. But it's almost too little, too late. But I'm glad to see we're sort of ahead of it. And I commend that on first. I commend that. I like wanting to do it. So thank you.
Thank you. And the folks who are online are having a hard time hearing our discussion, unfortunately, and we're getting to 7 o'clock. So I may close the virtual portion of this, but before I do, some of the comments that we just heard, we heard from the mayor of Bedford and Delegate Austin about support for rail and also support for multimodal transportation, not just highway funding, but also rail, and some more thank yous to the team for BFRRI. So thank you all very much online for sticking with us through the storm and audio issues, but please be sure if you have follow-up questions to email us or write to us, and hopefully we'll get on to these next steps. You'll be hearing some more news. Thank you. And I think we might be adjourned. Yes, we are adjourned, but please continue the conversation. I don't want to cut things off here.